The new roommate. Jake stepped into his dorm room at the Interstellar Academy with mixed feelings. He had spent months preparing for this opportunity to study alongside species from across the galaxy, but sharing a room with an alien. That was a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready for. He looked around the room. It was clean and bright, with two beds on opposite sides. One bed was neatly made, and beside it sat a pile of what looked like glowing blue orbs. Jake frowned. That must be his roommate's stuff. Just as he was inspecting the strange items, the door opened. In walked Lyra, his new roommate. She was tall and slender, with shimmering silver skin and large, expressive eyes that seemed to catch every detail in the room. Her movements were quiet, almost too delicate, as if she was afraid of disturbing the air around her. "Hello," Jake said, forcing a friendly smile. "You must be Lyra." "I'm Jake." Lyra nodded but didn't say much. She dropped her bag on the bed and started arranging her orbs without even looking at him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "So, what are those things?" he asked, pointing at the glowing orbs. Lyra hesitated before answering. "They are comfort spheres. They help me sleep." Her voice was soft and melodic, but there was something about her tone that made Jake feel like she wasn't telling the whole story. He decided not to push her. Instead, he tried to focus on unpacking his own things. Still, he couldn't help but steal glances at her. She moved with an odd grace, but there was a tension in her shoulders that made Jake wonder if she was nervous. Later that evening, as they both got ready for bed, Lyra finally spoke. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" Jake turned to her, surprised. "Sure. What's up?" She paused, her silver skin catching the faint glow of the orbs. "Can we push the beds together?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. "Push the beds together? Oh, why?" "It is tradition," she said, avoiding his gaze. "On my planet, we do not sleep alone. It is part of our culture." Jake let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking. But when Lyra didn't laugh with him, he realized she was serious. "Oh, I mean, that's kind of different, don't you think?" "It is important," Lyra said, her tone firm but still tinged with that quiet hesitance. "Please." Jake stared at her, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to offend her or disrespect her culture, but the idea of sharing a sleeping space with a stranger, an alien, no less, felt weird. "I'll think about it," he said finally, hoping to buy some time. That night, Jake lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. Lyra's request kept replaying in his mind. Why was it so important for her? Was it really just a cultural thing, or was there something else she wasn't telling him? Around midnight, Jake heard a sound. It was soft at first, like a faint whimper. He turned his head and saw Lyra sitting on her bed, clutching one of her comfort spheres. Her shoulders were shaking. "Lyra," Jake whispered, "are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she curled up tighter, her silver skin glinting in the moonlight. Jake hesitated before getting up and walking over to her bed. "Hey," he said gently. "What's wrong?" Lyra wiped her face quickly, as if trying to hide the fact that she'd been crying. "Nothing," she said, but her voice betrayed her. Jake frowned. "Look, if something's bothering you, you can tell me. I mean, we're roommates, right? We should try to, I don't know, get along or something." Lyra glanced up at him, her large eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. For a moment, Jake thought she might tell them the truth, but then she shook her head. "It's nothing," she said again, her voice firmer this time. Jake sighed. He didn't believe her, but he didn't want to push her too hard either. "All right," he said, stepping back. "But if you need anything, just let me know, okay?" Lyra nodded, and Jake returned to his bed. He lay awake for hours, listening to the faint sound of her crying. Something was definitely wrong, But Jake didn't know what. All he knew was that this was going to be a long semester. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's strange behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. What was she hiding? And why did it feel like her request to push the beds together was more than just a tradition? The question swirled in his mind, keeping him awake long after Lyra's quiet sobs had stopped. Little did Jake know, this was only the beginning of a mystery that would change both of their lives forever. The tradition. The next morning, Jake woke up feeling groggy. He had barely slept, his mind still circling around the strange events from the night before. Lyra was already up, sitting cross-legged on her bed, quietly braiding her long silver hair. She looked calm, as if the crying never happened. Jake rubbed his eyes and stretched. "Morning," he mumbled, trying to sound casual. Lyra glanced at him and nodded politely. "Good morning." For a moment, Jake considered asking her about the night before, but something about the way she avoided his eyes told him it wasn't the right time. Instead, he decided to let it slide. As the day went on, Jake tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to Lyra. There was something unsettling about how she carried herself, graceful but heavy with some invisible weight. By evening, Jake returned to their dorm room, tossing his bag onto the floor. Lyra was already there, sitting at the small desk by the window, reading a holotext that projected glowing symbols into the air. The blue light reflected softly on her skin. Jake hesitated before speaking. "Hey, about last night." Lyra stiffened slightly but didn't turn around. "You asked me about pushing the beds together," Jake continued, leaning against the wall. "Is that really something all Velarin do?" Lyra lowered the holotext and finally met his gaze. Her large, silver eyes looked even more intense in the dim light of the room. "Yes, it is part of our tradition," she said quietly. Jake crossed his arms. "Why?" Lyra hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "Velarin are not designed to sleep alone. From the time we are children, we share sleeping spaces with others, family, friends, even strangers if necessary. Physical closeness during rest is essential." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Essential? Like you can't sleep without it?" Lyra's eyes flickered to the floor. "It is more than that," she admitted softly. "Being alone during sleep can cause sickness." Jake's curiosity deepened. "Sickness?" Lyra nodded. "Our bodies react poorly to isolation at night. It begins with discomfort, then physical pain. Eventually, if the condition persists, it can lead to severe consequences." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Wait, you're telling me if you sleep alone for too long, you cold?" "I will not die," Lyra interrupted quickly, but the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "Not immediately." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" Lyra's eyes darkened. "I did not wish to make you uncomfortable. Humans value personal space. I understand that." Jake let out a long breath, feeling a wave of guilt. She had been trying to respect his boundaries, even at the cost of her own health. "Well, I guess we could push the beds together," Jake offered, trying not to sound too reluctant. "If it helps." Lyra's eyes lit up for a brief second, but the light faded just as quickly. "Thank you," she said softly, "but it may not be enough." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra shifted uneasily. "Being close to someone helps, but direct contact makes the difference." Jake froze. "Wait, you're saying we actually have to?" "No," Lyra said quickly, sensing his discomfort. "Only if the situation becomes worse." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. The idea of sharing a bed with an alien, no matter how innocent the reason, felt bizarre. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the image of Lyra trembling the night before, her silent tears soaking the edge of her pillow. "All right," Jake said finally. "Let's just see how it goes for now." That night, Jake and Lyra pushed their beds closer until they almost touched. It still felt strange, but Jake reminded himself this was just part of Lyra's culture. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, listening to the faint hum of the comfort spheres glowing around Lyra's side of the room. But even with the beds closer, the sound of soft, muffled crying filled the air. Jake clenched his fists. Why wasn't this helping her? The next morning, Jake made a decision. He wasn't just going to let this continue. During his break, he searched the Academy's database for information on the Velarin. He scanned article after article until he found one on Velarin biology. As he read, his stomach tightened. Velarin weren't just uncomfortable sleeping alone. It physically weakened them. The isolation affected their nervous system, and prolonged periods without contact could lead to irreversible damage. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Lyra hadn't told him the full truth. He returned to the dorm room, and Lyra looked up from her desk as he walked in. "Lyra," Jake said firmly, standing near her bed, "I need you to tell me everything. No more half-truths." Lyra's eyes flickered with surprise and something else. "I read about your species," Jake continued, crossing his arms. "Sleeping alone isn't just uncomfortable for you, is it? It's dangerous." Lyra lowered her gaze. "You're already sick, aren't you?" Jake pressed. Lyra hesitated, but finally she nodded. Jake let out a breath. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because it is shameful for a Velarin to rely on another, especially a human." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Shameful? You could die." "Lyra." "I know," Lyra said quietly. Jake ran a hand over his face. This wasn't just about cultural differences anymore. Lyra needed help, and he wasn't going to let her suffer in silence. Breaking point. The third night was when everything changed. Jake had tried his best. He pushed their beds together, closer than before, even letting the corners touch. Lyra had thanked him quietly, but the dark circles under her eyes hadn't faded. Every night, the room was filled with the same quiet sobbing that made it impossible for Jake to sleep. But that night was different. Jake woke up to a strange sound, labored breathing. At first, he thought it was just another restless night for Lyra, but when he turned his head, his stomach dropped. Lyra was curled up tightly on her bed, her body trembling violently. Her silver skin, which usually shimmered faintly under the soft glow of the comfort spheres, looked pale and dull. Sweat beaded across her forehead, and her breathing was shallow, almost like she was choking on air. "Lyra!" Jake shot up, scrambling out of bed. He crouched beside her, shaking her shoulder gently. "Hey, wake up. What's wrong?" Lyra's eyes flickered open, but they didn't focus. Her pupils, normally wide and bright, were faint slits of gray. She didn't respond, her entire body locked in some kind of painful spasm. Jake's heart pounded. This wasn't normal. He didn't know much about alien biology, but he could tell something was seriously wrong. "Lyra, come on, wake up." He shook her harder. Finally, she gasped, her body jerking as if she had just surfaced from underwater. Her chest heaved as she pulled in shaky breaths, but she looked utterly exhausted, her head lolling to the side. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "What the hell is happening to you? You can't keep hiding this from me." Lyra tried to sit up, but her limbs were too weak. She winced and collapsed back onto the bed. I'm sorry," she croaked. Jake grabbed one of her comfort spheres and pressed it into her hands, but she barely reacted. The glowing orb flickered faintly, as if her touch wasn't enough to activate it fully. "This isn't just some sleep issue, is it?" Jake's voice hardened. "You're sick, and it's getting worse." Lyra's eyes glistened with something that looked like guilt, but she didn't answer. Jake ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "Lyra, you need to tell me the truth. I can't help you if you keep hiding things." For a long moment, The room was silent except for Lyra's ragged breathing. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Velarin are not meant to endure isolation for long," she admitted. "Our bodies deteriorate. I thought I could manage, but I underestimated the effects." Jake clenched his fists. "How long?" Lyra's eyes met his, and in them, Jake saw the truth. "Too long." "I'm sorry," she whispered again, tears trailing down her cheeks. Jake sat down heavily on the bed beside her. He stared at the wall, his mind racing. "You're telling me you've been slowly dying right next to me, and you didn't think to mention it." "I didn't want to burden you," Lyra murmured. "It is shameful for a Velarin to depend so deeply on another. I thought I could handle it." Jake's frustration boiled over. "Lyra, that's insane. You can't just." He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. Yelling wouldn't solve anything. He looked at her fragile form, trembling beneath the thin blanket. Her body seemed so small now, so vulnerable. The pride and quiet dignity she always carried were gone, stripped away by the sheer weight of her condition. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "All right," he said softly. "What do we do now? How can I help?" Lyra hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she should answer, but she must have seen the resolve in Jake's eyes, because she finally spoke. "Physical contact stabilizes us," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even brief contact helps restore balance." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "So, you're saying we need to?" "Yes," Lyra interrupted quickly, as if she knew exactly what he was about to say. "But only during sleep. It will stop the deterioration." Jake swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. This was way beyond anything he had expected when he signed up for interstellar exchange. But as strange as it was, the thought of letting her suffer, letting her die, just because he felt awkward, that wasn't something he could live with. "All right," he said finally. "We'll figure it out." Lyra looked up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You would do that?" Jake gave a half smile, though he still felt unsure about the whole thing. "Yeah, I guess if we're gonna be roommates, we might as well keep each other alive." For the first time since he had met her, Lyra laughed softly. It was faint, but genuine. That night, Jake pulled his blanket over onto Lyra's side of the room. They didn't speak about it, but as Lyra drifted off to sleep beside him, her breathing evened out, and the trembling finally stopped. Jake stayed awake a little longer, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't exactly how he thought his time at the academy would go. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Trust and tension. The first night they shared a bed, Jake barely slept. Lyra, on the other hand, slept soundly for the first time since she arrived. Her breathing was slow and steady, her silver skin regaining a faint glow under the soft light of the comfort spheres. Jake lay on his side, stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. It wasn't that Lyra had done anything strange. She kept to her side, as far away as the narrow bed allowed. But the whole situation felt surreal. Just a week ago, they were strangers. Now he was her lifeline. Jake sighed quietly. Is this what interstellar cooperation looks like? The next morning, Lyra seemed different. She stood a little taller, her movements lighter and more fluid. Even her voice had a soft warmth that wasn't there before. "Thank you," she said over breakfast, her eyes meeting his for the first time without hesitation. "I feel much better." Jake shrugged, trying to play it off. "Glad to help. It's no big deal." But it was a big deal. Word got around fast at the Interstellar Academy. By the afternoon, Jake couldn't walk down the hall without someone shooting him a curious glance. A few of his classmates, especially the other humans, weren't subtle about it. "Dude, you're sharing a bed with your alien roommate." One of them, Mark, blurted out at lunch. "Is that even allowed?" Jake rolled his eyes. "It's not what you think." Mark smirked. "Oh, sure, not what I think. I'm just saying, Velrin are known for their close bonds with people they like. Jake set his fork down and leaned closer. She needs it to survive. It's a biological thing. Nothing else. Mark raised his hands in mock surrender. Hey, whatever you say, man. Just don't let her wrap you around her finger. Jake shook his head, but the words stuck with him longer than he expected. Later that day, Jake returned to the dorm, half expecting Lyra to overhear the teasing. But when he walked in, she was sitting by the window, gazing out at the academy courtyard below. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across her silver skin. Rough day? She asked without turning around. Jake flopped onto his bed. You could say that. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Because of me? Jake hesitated. He could lie and say no. But something about Lyra, the way she looked at him, the way she listened, made him tell the truth. Yeah, people are talking. Lyra's gaze lowered. I expected as much. Jake sat up, leaning his elbows on his knees. It's not your fault. It's just, humans aren't used to this kind of thing. They assume the worst. Lyra was quiet for a moment. On my planet, closeness is seen as trust, a bond of safety. It is difficult to understand why humans would mock such a thing. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. Humans have a weird habit of making jokes about things they don't understand. It's easier than admitting they're curious or uncomfortable. Lyra finally turned to face him, her expression soft but serious. If this causes you trouble, I can endure alone for a little while. I have rested enough. Jake frowned. Lyra, you were almost dying 3 days ago. Don't act like you're fine now. I don't wish to harm your reputation. Jake sighed, shaking his head. Look, I don't care what anyone else thinks. If this keeps you healthy, we'll keep doing it. I just need to get used to it. Lyra smiled faintly, and for the first time, Jake felt like they were genuinely on the same page. But things didn't stay simple for long. A week passed, and while Lyra's health improved, Jake began noticing subtle changes. She laughed more, spoke more openly, and even started joining him for lunch, something she had avoided before. At first, Jake was glad. It felt like they were actually becoming friends. But late at night, when the lights were off and Lyra lay asleep beside him, Jake couldn't ignore the shift. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Lyra's hand would brush against his arm. Once, he woke up to find her head resting lightly on his shoulder. She would always move away quickly when he stirred, as if embarrassed. Jake pretended not to notice, but the unease grew. One night, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Lyra, Jake whispered as they lay in the dark. Yes, her voice was soft, barely audible. Jake hesitated. You said this was just for survival. But is that really all it is? There was a long pause. Jake could almost hear her thinking. For me, it began that way. Lyra finally said, but the bond formed through shared rest is stronger than I anticipated. In Velrin culture, this level of trust is rare outside of family. Jake swallowed hard. So, what does that mean? Lyra shifted, propping herself up slightly on one elbow. Her silver eyes glowed faintly in the dark. It means I consider you someone important, someone I trust beyond just necessity. Jake's chest tightened. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Is that a problem? Lyra asked gently, sensing his hesitation. Jake forced a smile, even though she couldn't see it. No, it's not a problem. But deep down, he knew things were getting complicated. The secret, Jake had been ignoring the signs. At first, everything seemed fine. Lyra's health improved dramatically after they started sharing a bed. The dark circles under her eyes faded, and her strength returned. She began participating more in academy life, even helping Jake with some of his more difficult classes. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the accidental touches at night, or the way Lyra seemed to linger a little closer during the day. There was something else, something beneath the surface that Jake couldn't quite put his finger on. The first real sign came during one of their study sessions. Jake was sprawled out on his bed, flicking through holo notes, while Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, tapping away at her tablet. "You're really getting the hang of human mathematics," Jake said absently. Lyra gave a soft smile. "Numbers are universal, but humans complicate them unnecessarily." Jake snorted. "Yeah, that's fair." But then her fingers slowed, and her smile faded. Jake noticed something wrong. Lyra hesitated, her silver eyes narrowing slightly as she gazed at the tablet. "There is something I need to tell you." Jake sat up straight, immediately sensing the weight in her voice. "Okay, what is it?" She set the tablet aside carefully, as if buying herself time. Finally, she looked at him directly. "I haven't been completely honest about my condition." Jake's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Lyra folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders tense. "The sickness I told you about. It's not just discomfort. It affects more than my body." Jake frowned. "I figured that much. I mean, I saw how bad it got. But you're better now, right?" Lyra lowered her gaze. "Physically, yes. But the sickness isn't just physical. For Velrin, prolonged isolation causes neurological imbalances." Jake blinked. "Neurological? Like your brain?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Our species is designed to form bonds through shared sleep. When that bond isn't fulfilled, our minds begin to deteriorate. We lose touch with reality." Jake's eyes widened. "Wait, hold on. You're saying this can affect your mind? How far does it go?" Lyra's fingers curled tightly around the edge of her robe. "If left untreated, it can lead to complete neurological collapse." Jake felt his breath catch. Collapse. Like death. The word hung heavy in the air, cold and final. Jake shot to his feet. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" "Lyra, this is serious." "I know," Lyra said sharply, standing as well. For the first time, Jake saw real frustration flicker in her eyes. "I didn't want to frighten you. And I thought I could control it." Jake ran his hands through his hair, pacing the small room. "You can't control something like this. I mean, what if I hadn't agreed to share the bed? What if I said no?" Lyra's expression softened, and she sat down again. "I would not have let it reach that point. I would have left." Jake froze. "Left?" Lyra nodded. "Velrin are taught to withdraw when the sickness becomes too severe. It is our way of preserving dignity. I would have returned to my home planet quietly." Jake's stomach twisted at the thought. "You mean to die?" Lyra didn't answer. She didn't have to. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jake sank onto the bed, rubbing his temples. "Lyra, I can't believe you were willing to let that happen." "It is our way," Lyra said softly. "But I chose to stay because you were kind. Because you offered to help, even when you didn't fully understand." Jake exhaled slowly, his frustration shifting to something else, something heavier. "All right," he said, looking at her seriously. "No more secrets. If there's anything else I need to know, you tell me now." Lyra hesitated but eventually nodded. "There is one more thing," she admitted quietly. "The bond we form through shared sleep. It grows stronger over time. If it continues, the connection becomes permanent." Jake stiffened. "Permanent?" Lyra met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Yes. If we continue this for much longer, I will begin to depend on you. Not just physically, but mentally. It is rare between Velrin and humans, but it can happen." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "So, what happens if I leave? Or if we get reassigned to different rooms?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Severing the bond abruptly can cause severe trauma. For both of us." Jake stared at her, speechless. "This is why Velrin form these bonds only with family or life partners," Lyra explained quietly. "I never thought it would happen with a human, but it has begun." Jake leaned back, trying to process the weight of what she was saying. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that we're already bonded?" "Not fully," Lyra corrected gently, "but it is progressing." Jake felt like the room was spinning. He had signed up for interstellar exchange to learn about other cultures, not to accidentally form some life-altering bond with an alien roommate. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice quiet. Lyra's eyes softened. "We continue, if you are willing. I will not force this upon you. If you wish to stop, I will find another way." Jake looked at her for a long moment. Despite everything, the secrecy, the awkwardness, he couldn't ignore the trust in her eyes. She had been terrified to tell him the truth, yet here she was, laying it all out. Jake finally let out a breath and nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said, forcing a small smile. "I'm not going to let you go through this alone." Lyra's eyes glistened with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Jake." The decision. Jake didn't sleep that night. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty. The truth was finally out in the open. Lyra's condition was far worse than he had imagined. Their bond was growing stronger, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The idea of permanent attachment was unsettling. He hadn't signed up for this, hadn't prepared for the consequences of something so deep. He tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling in the dim light. The room felt smaller, somehow, as if the walls were closing in on him. He didn't even know what to say to Lyra anymore. When morning came, Jake was exhausted, but his mind was no clearer. He walked into the dorm's shared living area to find Lyra sitting by the window, staring out at the horizon. The academy skyline was framed by distant stars, but Jake wasn't sure if he was looking at a peaceful view or just the cold, uncharted distance between them. Lyra turned to him when he entered, her gaze steady but cautious. There was an underlying tension in the air now, a weight neither of them had felt before. "Jake," she said softly, as if testing the waters. "You've been quiet." Jake hesitated. His fingers drummed restlessly on the desk in front of him. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about everything you said last night. The bond. What it means." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly got up and walked over to him, her steps silent. She looked at him with that same serious expression, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's not just physical anymore," Jake said, meeting her gaze. "And I get it now. Why it's important for you, why you need it. But this is a lot, Lyra. I'm not sure what this is turning into. I don't even know if I can handle this kind of attachment." Lyra's face softened, but there was no surprise in her eyes. She had seen the conflict in his face for days now. She had expected this moment, but it didn't make it any easier. "I understand," she replied, her voice quiet. "I never wanted to force you into something you're not ready for. This bond, it's a heavy responsibility. I know it might be more than you can bear." Jake ran his hands through his hair, frustration building again. "I don't even know how I got here. I thought we were just helping each other out. And now, you're telling me I'm part of something that could change everything. Forever." Lyra took a step closer, her eyes earnest. "You are part of it, whether you want it or not. That is the nature of the bond. But the decision is still yours. We can stop this. I'll leave. I'll find another way to survive, even if it means returning to my planet. I'll endure it alone." Jake stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. "You can't just leave because things are getting complicated. You almost died because of this, and I'm not going to let you suffer in silence again, but I'm not sure how to deal with the rest of it." Lyra's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to deal with it alone. You're not trapped in this, Jake. You have the power to choose. I want you to be certain. If you stay, I will never force you to do anything you are uncomfortable with. But know that the longer we share this bond, the harder it will be to separate." Jake stopped, standing in the middle of the room, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his thoughts. The truth was, he didn't want her to leave. Despite the confusion, despite the tension, something inside him had shifted. Lyra had become more than just a roommate. She had become someone he cared about. The thought of her returning to her home planet, dying alone because of this disease, was unbearable. But the bond, the idea that it could become permanent, that their lives might be forever intertwined in ways he didn't fully understand, was terrifying. Could he handle that? Could he deal with the emotional and physical toll it would take on both of them? "I don't know if I can be what you need," Jake said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can handle this dependency." Lyra nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I never wanted you to feel trapped. You don't need to be what I need. You just need to make the choice. I can be alone again, if that's what you choose. I will accept it." Jake looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her expression. She wasn't just some alien stranger anymore. She had opened up to him in ways that went beyond cultural boundaries. She had trusted him when she didn't have to. He exhaled a deep breath. "I don't want you to suffer. I just don't know what's going to happen if I keep going along with this." Lyra's voice was steady, almost resigned. "The bond will grow stronger. You will begin to depend on me in the same way. And I will depend on you, but only if you allow it. If we stop now, I will find a way to survive without you. But if you stay..." Jake stopped pacing and turned to face her. He could see the depth of her trust, the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Something deeper, more genuine than any alien-human relationship he had ever known. "I'm not sure what the right answer is," Jake said quietly. "But I do know this. I can't leave you. Not like this." Lyra's eyes softened with gratitude, but there was a quiet sadness there too. "Then we will walk this path together," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The decision had been made. They would continue, no matter how difficult it was. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of them. The bond would grow stronger, and with it, so would the complications. Would they be able to handle the weight of it? Would they truly be able to live in harmony, or would the bond tear them apart in the end? For now, all Jake could do was take the next step. But the path they had chosen was uncertain, and the future loomed large, shadowed by the promise of a connection that neither of them could escape. Resolution. Days turned into weeks, and the tension that had once hung heavy in the air slowly began to fade. It wasn't that the uncertainty had disappeared. It was still there, lurking, an invisible weight neither of them could shake off. But they had made their decision. They had chosen to face whatever came next, together. Jake had learned to sleep through the soft, reassuring sound of Lyra's breathing beside him. The nights had become a strange comfort. He wasn't used to it, but the more time passed, the more he accepted it. The bond between them grew stronger with every passing day. But strangely, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt right. And yet, Jake knew that the bond wasn't just about comfort. There was something deeper at play, something he couldn't ignore. Each day, he felt it more acutely. The way his thoughts often drifted toward Lyra. How he found himself seeking her presence even during the day, even when they weren't together. It wasn't just because of her health anymore. It wasn't just because she depended on him. No, something inside Jake was changing too. One evening, as they sat together in their dorm room, studying for an upcoming exam, Jake looked over at Lyra. She was focused on her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. The soft glow of the comfort spheres illuminated her face, casting her silver skin in a warm, almost ethereal light. For the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to really look at her, not as a roommate, not as a person he was trying to help, but as someone he truly cared for. Lyra glanced up, sensing his gaze. She smiled gently. "What is it, Jake?" Jake blinked, realizing he'd been staring. Nothing. I was just thinking." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure how to put the words together. "About us. About how this whole situation turned out." Lyra's smile softened, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. You mean how everything has changed? Jake nodded. Yeah, I didn't expect it to turn out like this. I didn't think I could handle it. But now, I don't know. I'm still not sure what to make of this bond, Lyra. But I'm starting to realize I don't think I want to go back to what it was before. Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the comfort spheres. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. Jake, this bond, it is not just a physical connection. It's something that ties us, something deeper. It is not just about survival anymore. It is about trust. It is about us, who we are together. Jake sat back, running a hand through his hair. I know, and that scares me sometimes. Lyra tilted her head, her silver eyes searching his face. Why? Because I'm afraid I'll lose myself in this, Jake said. I've never been good with closeness. I've always kept people at arm's length. But now, he trailed off, his words suddenly feeling inadequate. Now it's like I can't separate myself from you. And that's both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Lyra was silent for a long moment. Then she said, I know that fear. I felt it too. But the bond we share is not one of loss. It is one of discovery. We are discovering who we are through each other. That is what makes it beautiful, Jake. We are not losing ourselves. We are becoming something more. Together. Jake let her words sink in. And for the first time, he truly understood. It wasn't about the fear of losing himself. It was about the growth that could come from this bond. The way it had already shaped him. The way it had opened his heart in ways he hadn't known were possible. He smiled, though it was a little shaky. I guess I'm just not used to trusting someone like this. Lyra reached out, her hand brushing his arm gently. It was a simple touch, but it was enough to send a warm sensation spreading through Jake's chest. You don't have to be. I will always be here, Jake. You don't have to be afraid of this connection. It's not something that takes away from you. It adds to you. Jake looked at her then, really looked at her. The silver light from the comfort spheres softened the edges of her features, and for the first time, he saw her not just as an alien, not just as a roommate, but as someone who had shared something deeply personal with him. She had trusted him in ways he couldn't have imagined, and in doing so, she had made him see the world and himself differently. I think I'm starting to understand that, Jake said, his voice quiet but certain. Maybe this wasn't what I expected, but maybe that's the best part. It's a new kind of trust, and I'm ready to keep learning what that means. Lyra smiled, and it was a smile full of warmth, full of understanding. Then we will continue to learn together. The bond between them wasn't perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, still times when the weight of their connection felt heavy. But in those moments, they had learned to face it together, without fear, without hesitation. They had become more than just roommates, more than just an alien and a human trying to make it work. They had become partners in a journey neither of them had planned, but one that was uniquely their own. And in the end, Jake knew this. Despite the unknowns, despite the challenges ahead, he wasn't alone. They weren't alone. Together, they would navigate whatever came next. It was no longer just about survival. It was about living, about choosing to embrace the bond and everything it brought with it.